Matthew Darcy, so I'm a Senior Communications Consultant with Highland Marketing. For those of you that don't know us, we are a sector-specific health tech communications agency. We've been supporting companies in this sector now for close to a quarter of a century. So we've been really championing the role of health tech for that time. And with that, we've bringing you today a conversation around really two of the audiences in health tech that you may need to influence to gain traction with your technologies. Those audiences particularly being the Chief Information Officer within the NHS and also the Chief Nursing Information Officer. And what better way to bring you a perspective from that, from the people who've done that throughout their careers. So we have Professor Natasha Phillips and Neil Perry with us today. Natasha was the National Chief Nursing Information Officer for NHS England, and Neil was the Director of Digital Transformation at Dartford and Gravesham NHS Trust. So I'll just hand over to you, Natasha and Neil, just to briefly introduce yourselves a little bit more than that, if that's okay, please. So Natasha.
Thank you, Matthew. Hello, everyone. Yes, Natasha, I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for 30 years. My clinical specialty is intensive care. And then obviously over the years, I guess I became what one might call a digital clinical nurse specialist and ultimately a CNIO at UCLH, where I led the implementation of an enterprise-wide EPR. And that led me to the centre on a mission to ensure that nurses had much more of a voice in shaping the future of healthcare with digital technologies. I now work independently as a consultant, and I also run an organisation called Future Nurse, and we have a growing community of nurses, some of them very senior nurses in the NHS, who are very engaged in innovation and keen to work much more closely with the health tech industry to ensure that we are involved in more of the ideation phase as well as the implementation phase of technology.
Thanks, Natasha. And over to you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Neil Perry, former CIO for an acute trust, as Matthew said. 25 years in the NHS and 16 years as leading digital for that trust. Got known as introducing lots of first of types and innovation into the NHS. So brought in some of the first EPRs back at the turn of the century, and brought in some of the medtech, wearables, AI, artificial intelligence, and just tried to do things slightly differently and sort of go further faster. Left the NHS 18 months ago now, similar to Natasha, a digital health consultant.
Thank you, Neil. So as Jonathan said at the beginning of this, please do show your questions in the chat. We will have a good section for a Q&A at the end of this. Before we get to that, we're just going to touch on some areas that really matter to CNIOs and CIOs in the NHS, the things that you might find useful as you're marketing your own solutions. And this is really your chance to get those questions across. Of course, there is chance beyond this as well. We've dropped a link in the chat, so for anyone who'd like to engage separately after this for a more detailed one-to-one conversation, there's details about how you can reach out there. But to begin with, Natasha, really from a CNIO's perspective in the NHS, how do clinical priorities really shape decisions, and what are the key technologies that really sit on the agenda of a CNIO? And indeed, do you think that with technology that nurses are actually sufficiently engaged by the technology sector?
Right, let me try and take those in order. So I guess the simple answer is probably not enough in terms of, why we're bringing in tech to address priority. So clinical priority should often be the starting point. But I think if you speak to clinicians and nurses specifically, they would say it often feels like we're starting with the technology and then trying to make it fit into the way we work, rather than thinking about what is the work that you do and how might technology support you. And I think that's probably for a number of reasons. If I go from the sort of nursing perspective, I just think we haven't been at the table as part of those conversations until relatively recently. And I guess then part of that evolution of us being involved has been the role of the CNIO. So when I started at NHS England, only 20% of trusts had a CNIO. Now 80% of organisations have a CNIO. And that was in large part to the work we did at the centre, saying this is really important, and having our Chief Nurse for England, Ruth May, stand up at Rewired about 3 years ago now. It was in my first year of my tenure as National CNIO, to say, this is really important, chief nurses, you all need one of these roles. But I think what's happened is we've seen CNIOs quite bogged down in EPRs. So what technologies are they focused on? Largely electronic patient records, because they consume a lot of time in terms of the whole process from procurement through to implementation, and quite boggy in that implementation space. For some in the virtual care space, there's work going on, but nurses really want more technology that supports person-centred care. So there's an appetite from CNIOs and the wider community to hear more about technologies that support person-centred care and move beyond the EPR. I think we're probably all a little bit stuck on just getting that EPR in at the moment, which slows us down. So I think the CNIO role is important. They act as a translator for the chief nurse and should be giving the heads up. You know, when I was a CNIO working really closely with my CIO, the likes of Neil, you know, a good CIO will make sure that clinicians are brought in. Sometimes they're not, and that's why you need to stick your elbows out and say, we need to be here. But I think a lot of them haven't got the space. We need to think of other ways where we're getting the technology in front of them, and I think that will probably, some of that will evolve through this conversation we're about to have.
Of course, and I think that's a really interesting point you make, Natasha, about this is more than EPRs, as much as that consumes your bandwidth when you're in that role quite a lot. So, Neil, from your point of view as a former CIO in the NHS, what are the main challenges that Chief Information Officers face when it comes to adopting what we might describe as new health tech, the innovations that companies that might be members of the ABHI have to offer?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the challenges are fairly common across the NHS, whether it be acute, mental health, community, primary care, across the board. I'd say broadly they are budget, just not enough of it to do everything that we'd love to do. The range of priorities that we're given, people pulled in so many different directions, it becomes very hard to hear all the different voices of people shouting what they want, what they need, with governments all saying do this and do that, and your own local trust priorities. And every trust, we all like to think we're different, and we are in different positions for readiness of adoption, and that brings its own challenges. But the range of priorities, the capacity, I think, is probably the biggest struggle we have, whether it be the CIO, the IT department, the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Nurse Information Officer, or actually on the shop floor, if I'm allowed to call it that. Everyone's so busy that it's hard to get time. So if you do manage to get half an hour in diary, or even 15 minutes in diary of a CNIO or a CIO, be super grateful because and use that time really wisely. Use it to build up a bit of a rapport and things. But yeah, capacity, and through that capacity issue comes the engagement issue. As Natasha said, you've got to get really rich engagement to get buy-in of any solution, whether it be an EPR or sort of integrated medtech. And actually, just because of that capacity issue and all the priorities that are going on, getting really good engagement is a real tricky thing to solve in the NHS.
Of course, and so I think really that given those time demands that you described there, Neil, and I think this is probably a question for both of you, if that's okay, please. I guess making your marketing effective and making sure those messages resonate with the CIO and CNO, you've got to get their attention pretty quickly, presumably. So what, in your experience, really works from health tech vendors when it comes to messages that resonate? Can you think of perhaps good or even bad examples of things that from your career?
Shall I go first, Natasha?
Yeah. Please, yeah.
So I think I'll start with the bad, so I can finish on a positive on this one then. The bad is buzzwords without substance, definitely. So people come to us with the latest buzzword and then absolutely nothing behind it, sort of say what it is. Typically, at the moment, we've seen, so my past 25 years in the NHS, there's always been the latest buzzword, but the one at the moment is AI. And if you claim something to be AI and it's not really, and if it's just really a good algorithm that we've always had and always seen things, just be honest and say what it is, because actually calling something AI complicates things. It will make things harder. There's more hurdles to jump through to achieve adoption. It starts to scare people off as well, because actual true AI is a little bit uncontrolled and you don't know what the answer is going to be, but actual deep algorithms and things that have been tested and trialed things and controlled become repeatable. So yeah, just be very mindful of, don't use buzzwords unnecessarily. Be truthful as to what things are. The good, if I move to that, the good is having a story and explaining how the tech can impact patients and clinicians. We don't really, I mean, I don't really want to hear how tech's going to improve tech itself for tech's sake. You want to hear the story and the pathway of a patient pathway and how the tech can speed that pathway up, solve problems in there, remove bottlenecks and things, improve care. And from a CIO perspective, certainly my own perspective anyway, I always like to get a little bit closer to what's going on clinically, because we're not clinicians. We live in that world and we're very close to it, but actually the minutiae of what goes on in different pathways and the specialisms and things, the more we can learn and understand, the more we can support our teams as well. So it's kind of the good side of marketing and engagement from the supplier communities, helping us go on that journey and learn as well. So yeah, having the good story and explaining a good story and explaining things really nicely.
Thank you, Neil. That's great. Over to you, Natasha.
So I guess if I think about the worst examples I've had, the bad is these overly long presentations and demonstrations where you're sat there thinking, what on earth has this got to do with me? How is this going to make my life easier or make care better? And so obviously the converse of that is real kicking off with showing how this is going to help. And that starts with listening, I think. And I guess that's kind of a tricky situation, isn't it? Because the contradiction, if you've only got 15 minutes, how do you grab attention really quickly and build that listening relationship? I actually think it's okay to start with the listening, or at least be able to play back an understanding of that world. And that probably comes from being able to pitch in that way, means before you've even got in that position, you've engaged these people in all stages of the development and design of your product, in how you're going to market it. So approaching organizations like Future Nurse to say, hey, we really think we've got an idea and we'd really like the thoughts of your community before we step into the space where we're going to be trying to sell this into the NHS. You know, we generally, you know, people want to give their support and expertise to support great tech coming in. So make the most of that really, and make the most of those connections, rather than just pitching up with something that you've worked so hard and you're so proud of it. You want to tell everything, and you have this really long presentation with all the things you want to get across, but it's become quite disconnected.
Of course, it's a very much that almost co-designed from the beginning, really, with that approach, both in your conversations around marketing and in the product itself. Perhaps, really, that's part of that.
Some of the best health tech I see is where they do have, you know, nurse advisors, clinical advisors of all varieties in their team. Then they're really starting to hit the mark.
Sure. Okay. Well, I think just expanding on a couple of those points, Neil, you mentioned, really, I think you touched on things like the bottlenecks and things like that there that are really helpful to solve through technology. But what are the key things that a CIO really wants to know, you know, from those technical messages to operational to clinical things? What are the things that really work?
Yeah, so as I said, the story, I think, is where I'd start. And I'd want to know what the typical current state is. So I don't know if we're talking a new innovation around ECGs, 24 tape monitors and things like that. We've seen the markets moving to patches and things that could be worn for 14 days or longer, and disposable patches and things that can get that and more. So you want to know what the current typical state is and what the problem is that this tech's going to solve. And I'd lead with that, because we don't always know. There's so many different, I would dread to think how many interventions there are and how many conditions there are. But if you're focusing on one or a certain area, you've got to bring that story with you. So what's the current typical state? How does the solution actually solve that? Can you cut down the pathway? Can you take something that takes 6 weeks to actually get to the point of a report and bring it down to the next day? That's the kind of stuff that's going to really improve things. And they're the stories that you want to tease out and help educate people as well. So some did you know statements and things that's based on evidence and sort of the listening that's gone on. So if you go and listen to the trust of what the pains are, And if your solution can solve that, you can feed that back to people that may not be as close to the problems, to the actual clinical flows and things of that. Can the tech reduce unnecessary patient waits, things like that? Going back to the bad stuff, I don't think anyone really gets excited if you say a bit of tech can save 1 minute per patient on an inpatient stay. There's lots of tech out there that claims that, but that 1 minute is gone 10 times over because everyone's working so busy anyway. Yes, there's incremental changes, things that can help and things, but you want something that's going to make a big impact quite easily as well. So beyond the story and what does it actually do, because we don't buy tech for the sake of buying tech. Some of us like to see shiny things. I'm guilty of that, but we buy it because it's going to solve a problem. So what problem is it going to solve? Has the entire pathway been looked at? The amount of times I've seen tech and they solve a small piece of it, but haven't thought of all the other pieces of the pathway. And all you're doing is releasing a bottleneck from one place and it moves on to the next place, and then you've got to find something else. And the cost of the interventions ends up adding up to the point that it's just not going to fly. So you need to look at the entire pathway and how can you solve those, and partnering with other tech. If you can't, if one solution doesn't do it all, you need to have the partners that can come in and say, right, we can solve this pathway and this is the total cost of solving it and this is the total benefit. And then I guess I want to know if there's a clinical champion already inside my organisation. Brilliant. Outside my organisation, a neighbouring organisation, great, we can talk to them. But inside the organisation, if you've already had that conversation with a clinical lead and they're championing it and saying we need this, well, that's just knocked down about 10 of the barriers to adoption already. So it then just becomes about finances and bringing other people on the journey. And I think I'd want an honest view from suppliers. I'd appreciate an honest view from suppliers as to their status. Are they a startup? Are they sort of medium range, or are they verging on legacy technology that's been widely adopted? Legacy might be the wrong term because I don't think anyone would ever be that honest. But where it's more older, established tech, you want to know what you're buying, really, aren't you? They're the key things to me. Then after those, then I want to know about your credentials around clinical safety, DTACs and things like that, as to, right, have you got the right credentials? Are you MHRA registered and things like that? And you kind of go through a stage of filtering these stuff out and going, right, okay, is this ready to be adopted, or is it just a early stage concept? And I'm not against early stage concepts. I've done a lot of it. It's had huge success and huge benefits, but you just need to know what you're getting yourself into right up front.
So no, that's a really comprehensive answer. I think the detail in what you've shown there shows this really needs to be about really creating that whole story about the problems you're solving and everything that sits around it. And from experience, having worked with a lot of health tech companies over the years doing this, I think it's certainly a lot more than the perhaps bland messages that you might, forgive me for using that phrase, you might see on some exhibition stands if you walk around a conference that say something as generic as we improve patient outcomes through data or something like that, which might be, non-descriptive. It's getting into that detail of how you solve those problems. Natasha, from your point of view, what are those biggest problems that need to be solved, and how can companies really think about framing the messages, whether that's things around clinical outcomes, patient safety, productivity, whatever it is that they're helping to address? From your point of view, where do messages really come in that are effective there?
Yeah, so I guess if I'm thinking from like what's on the chief nurse's portfolio on the board, yeah, and these probably issues that affect the whole board, but they're particularly on their agenda in terms of what they're responsible for. So workforce, we have a 50,000 shortage of nurses in this country. We're looking for stuff that can help us to manage that, and part of managing that is about retention and joy at work. So are you going to give me tech that's going to make it easier for my nurses to do their job, through to, is this a piece of technology that can help me manage a scarce resource better, and use data much better in order to do that? So I think it's about workforce, capacity, in terms of the the volume of patients. So our biggest challenge is capacity, and a number of patients that we have in hospital that have multiple comorbidities. It will be interesting to see where we go with this, with Lord Darcy's shifts to the hospital to community, analog to digital, disease to population health. We've been talking about this for many years. I do think technology is probably the biggest lever for this, and nurses are really well placed here, because essentially the role is about helping people to be healthy and cope, live with whatever disease they have, as opposed to purely just disease management. So as a chief nurse, I'm thinking at an ICS level, right, how am I going to have technology that supports me to get more person-centered care to the patient and manage some of that? If you look at the QNI report that they do every 5 years on digital health, you'll see it's not shifted at all. Community nurses are still saying it's really bad out here. It's really hard. We don't have technology that makes it easy to do our jobs. We have to do lots of duplicative work. So the role of the nurse is to join up care across the system, and they spend a phenomenally long amount of their time doing that. Something like 25% of their time is spent on that, 25% on meds admin. If you can start to talk about how you're going to give them back time, then you're starting to tackle my workforce challenge, you're starting to tackle my capacity challenge. And then my next biggest issue is safety and quality, which runs through the whole thing. So how is this going to make care safer? What technologies have you got that are going to help us to keep people safer? And if we think about some of the virtual ward technologies, I mean, they just hit all those markers, don't they? So if you can hit more than one, I think that's where you need to be. You need to be able to tell the story, as Neil says, about how that works. So if I was to tell a story about virtual wards, if I think about a service that I've worked with down in Norfolk and Norwich, what I would be able to say is, it's really helping them to retain nurses who otherwise couldn't stay in the workforce, that they would leave if they weren't delivering this type of care. They're getting real joy from delivering this care because they can focus on the individual. We are improving capacity by keeping people out of hospital. The people that we serve are saying, this is really great care. I love it. I enjoy being at home. And we can demonstrate the safety benefits as well. So having a story that talks to all of those really succinctly is really, really important. And those are the key challenges that we're facing now. So we're looking around at what are the key technologies that can help us address those big problems, whichever sector you're in. And the solutions are probably oftentimes the same, but the application is different. So understanding your use case is super important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Natasha. And I think both of your responses there, just for anyone who's listening today, who's thinking, well, I've got a new solution, I've got something different. These busy people are very tied up dealing with EPR programs and things like that. How can I get in front of them? I think the answers you've been giving there just really demonstrate the complexity of message they might really need to think about developing. So fundamentally, the problems that are being solved and how that's being done, and making sure that's communicated. It's not just about that technology, of course. Moving this forward a little bit in conversation, getting your messages right is clearly vital, but how can you get them out there is perhaps the other consideration for marketeers in health tech. Neil, from your point of view, what are the best channels that can be used to reach CIOs in the NHS? How important are things like case studies about PR, getting your messages out in the media, through to things like webinars like this, for example? What are the real things that you found useful in your role?
Yeah, so influencers, I mean, we live in a world of TikTok, don't we? Influencers are key. Not on TikTok, really, because that's going to get my 16-year-old son excited and not the clinical workforce, although those short TikTok-style messaging are brilliant. It's getting that story across. So you can get your story into, I don't know how long a TikTok is these days, but like a 1 minute pithy little videos and things. That's probably a great way to do it. But the way I think is the internal influencers. So if you've got clinicians, or if it's an operational solution that solves solutions around capacity site-wide, as it were, rather than individual cases, sorry, just throwing things around, then they're going to influence the CIO. They're going to influence the tech people that can help and sit in capital meetings and budget setting meetings and do all the number crunching side of things. The internal influencers are probably the biggest thing. other ways is if it's innovative tech, there are, I don't know if I'm allowed to say, but things like some of the tech influence there, the medical futurist, I think I would go to. That's someone who's always influenced me, Bertie Mesker. Watching his sort of things for the past, God knows how many years, you see the tech that's on the horizon. If you can get in front of that and get them talking about the technology, that's going to influence a small number of people that are up for the innovation side of things. But those small number of people spread and grow as adoption takes up. It's then the NHS sells to the NHS. We buy stuff that our colleagues have bought and they rate and they recommend. Beyond that, and in a similar theme, I guess I think e-zines, I think we call them now. I was going to say magazines, but I guess it's e-zines because no one reads paper anymore, do they? So these e-zines that are out there and focused on specific marketeers, I guess, that are focused on healthcare rather than general marketing is a good way. And then obviously be where your customers are. So I guess all the trade shows and things, your Rewired Hets and those kind of things are where the CIOs go. There's more for the clinicians, and there's Confed is normally quite a good one as well to get a broader range than just hitting a CIO, because actually you want the CIOs to be influenced by other people. I think that's my main point. So yeah, I think 4 or 5 things there.
So I think
Influencers.
That's reassuring, Neil, to hear that breadth of channels as one of those health tech marketing specialists that you referred to. But I mean, we're certainly seeing perhaps the evolution of things like podcasts and things like that in the general domain, particularly perhaps in the context of the recent US elections. The media channels that have been successful have not necessarily always been the traditional ones. So perhaps it is just worth thinking about that mix. Natasha, from your point of view, really from a nurse's point of view, what really works well for reaching out to that nursing community, as well as perhaps the CNIO and the senior board team that might be involved in driving decisions? Where would you tend to find out about the things that are going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, just reflecting on this, we keep labouring for, but storytelling here is really important, and we want to hear about the things that have worked. And what's really important, I think Neil alluded to, is from people like us, customers. So the nursing community, like all other communities, look at what's everybody else doing. So I think thinking differently about the places that you go to. Podcasts are a great thing for this community because it often you can listen to them on the way home from a shift. I think thinking about what is your particular technology, and yes, there's the big sort of traditional wider arenas where big health tech trade shows where there's a bit of everything, but what is your product particularly and which sector are you going for, and get to their events. I think thinking creatively about how you can hear their voices through smaller sort of listening sessions. So working with people like us at Future Nurse, we can go, come and ask, and we'll say, yeah, we can get you this group of people, and you can start to listen and have that conversation with that particular group is important. Nurses are quite actually, once you get in, it's quite easy to influence, and they grow really well as a community. So there's a really large CNIO community, and they're very active, and they influence each other a lot, and they collaborate well. So just even when you've got a relationship with one, asking about their colleagues, finding out ways that they can help you to meet others. If they believe in your product, they'll push it for you, really. They'll tell their colleague in the next trust along or in another part of the country that this is really, I've had this really great experience. And I'm going to go back to a previous question and say, so yes, it's about that getting the product in sale, but part of what they'll be talking about is their experience of working with you. So they want to know that they feel heard, that you're supported, that perhaps you're helping them. These are really time poor people. So what have you got in place around reducing the effort of implementation for them, so they can tell the story? I worked with this organisation. Not only do they have a great piece of tech, but they really helped me, and they were sharing. They're super spreaders, not in the bugs perspective, but more, that often as consultants like Neil or I, or as people selling their technology, you see a lot of what goes on in different organizations. So don't underestimate the knowledge you have and how you might be able to share that as a super spreader across organizations. In terms of the platforms like TikTok and and Instagram. I mean, I've explored those as part of our work around Future Nurse, and there is a very early career nursing community there, and it's quite sad to hear what they have to say really about how frustrated they are. The spaces where the CNIOs are tend to be LinkedIn as a professional space, and I think some have decided to stay with X, but many are leaving in droves. But I'm really curious about exploring those other spaces like Insta and TikTok. I actually think there might be a way of creating new channels.
Absolutely, and I think it's those new channels that people in this on this webinar will undoubtedly be exploring themselves. I'm sure it'd be interesting to hear anyone's stories of that who might be listening in today. I think one thing you touched on there, Natasha, that struck me is that you can have those super spreaders. It's about the advocacy of your existing customers as much as it is you selling your product. Let your customers sell it for you in some instances, and that's something we found always to be extremely compelling when we're talking to users of that technology and people who have implemented it, really telling their story about the impact. I remember one story we told probably 6-7 years ago now, and it was quite a straightforward story in some ways. It was around an e-observation system that had been implemented in NHS 5 in Scotland, and the whole story really came together that showed the clinical impact. They'd reduced cardiac arrest by 2/3 in the busiest area within 6 months. It had the different stories of different nurses, of consultants, of various individuals coming together to show that real change in clinical practice. So it's joining the metrics up with everything else that sat in really nicely there. So I mean, how practical is it though today? I mean, you mentioned everyone's really busy. Do you think that your peers are ready and willing to be supportive customer voices for those technologies and to spread the word even further? Is it okay to approach them with that idea, do you think?
I think yes. I think how can you help them do it though? So give them really great material that helps capture stories, and you have the resource and time to turn those into really useful artifacts that could be repurposed. Give voice to your customers and give them platforms, sponsorship, things like that for clinicians that get them places so that they can be using their voice. I think there's lots of ways you can help, and yes, it is practical, even possible even in a time poor environment, if you can take some of the effort of it away from the individual who's got a massive agenda.
Of course, and I think the clients we work with, we've always spoken to them on the basis that don't be afraid to approach your customers for this. They are busy people, but actually this is putting them in the spotlight. It's perhaps advancing their own careers, perhaps, or the initiatives in their organisations. And there are ways you can support that. For example, talking to them, doing the hard work, writing something perhaps for them, and just getting them to approve it can be one way that we found can be quite effective.
And awards and partnership awards, those platforms that give things, HSJ and all the others. But no, I judged the Nursing Times Awards recently for Best Workplace Health Tech, and we ran some awards for our recent joint conference between Nursing Times and Future Nurse, where we had a category for the Best Health Tech Partner. And actually, we didn't get nearly enough nominations. I know there's some brilliant stuff out there, so be looking out for those and using those opportunities to promote them. I think would be a tip from me.
Fantastic. I'm conscious there's lots of great questions coming in through the chat. Please do keep them coming. We'll come to those in just a moment. But just to wrap up really with a final question for both of you, really, and I'll come to you, Neil, first, if that's okay. What if there's one piece of advice that you would give to those people that are marketing, scaling, selling health tech, and really trying to engage with the audiences such as yourself, such as others who might need to influence that decision? What would that advice be?
Matthew, you're never going to get one piece of advice from myself or Natasha. So grab a pen. No, it won't be that long. So I think the first thing I'd say is don't pin everything on the CIO. Everyone's trying to get hold of the director of IT, the director of digital, because yes, they are a huge influencer internally to be able to get hold of money, and they've set a lot of the strategy around how we think things will work. But that has opened up massively in the past, I'm going to say probably 10 years, but more so the last 5 years, that the CNIO and the CCIO are becoming, or as already, as influential. Depends organisation to organisation. That's how influential people are. But in terms of the digital, the techies side of things, don't pin it on the CIO. Use their their teams as well, because they can be just as influential. So the head of IT, the network manager, the server manager, if they know often the network guys are the ones working with medtech, getting the medtech onto the network and understand what it can do. And they can be huge influencers of, did you know we could do this, that and the other? So I don't know, imaging machines and things, mobile imaging. It's often the network manager or one of the network team will say, or the server team as well, actually, I guess, will say, did you know we could actually open up a portal and send stuff to another trust instantly, rather than people burn it to a CD and put it in taxis and things like that? They've got the solutions there because they're engaging with the medtech suppliers of getting this technology set up. They know what the boundaries or what it can do. So use them as influencers as well, because the more people singing your song and singing it well are going to influence across the board. So do that. So my short thing is, I think for suppliers, they need to be open, they need to be honest and be helpful, help educate us so we can help ourselves effectively.
And Natasha, if you were to wrap up in 60 seconds with your one piece of advice, what would
Oh,
that
okay.
be?
So I would build on Neil's and say, yeah, don't just focus on the CNIO either. There's a whole clinical nurse specialist community that make services run. So the wider community, but also educate your customers well. You know the structures on how things should go. So one of my frustrations as CNIO is I love all this innovation, but it's also sometimes like the Wild West, and you find some CNS has gone out and her and her lead clinician have got a great idea and they're running off and trying to do things on their own in a different part of the organisation. So that steer back in, use them as a conduit in, but ask the questions about how do you make decisions around here? How do you make your investment decisions? And then work with them to sort of navigate your way through that pathway to a decision, because otherwise you can find yourself a long way down a path and then the shutters come down because we've reached the governance of the organisation who say we can't do it like that. So save yourself time in that respect. So yes, invest in them, but push them in that direction.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natasha. So we're going to come to your questions now. And John, I think you're going to come back in and lead on fielding these questions. So I just hand back over to you, if that's okay, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. Fantastic discussion so far. Thanks, Natasha and Neil. And plenty of questions coming in, which is fantastic, is what we like. So I'm going to rattle through these and we'll try and get through everyone in the time we've got. I think this was right off the back of one of the comments you made, Neil, around e-zines, publications, outlets. Are there any that stand out for you both, so that our colleagues on the line can utilise as part of their own marketing strategies? I'll start with you, Neil, first, if that's all right.
Yes, I guess the online rags, the e-zines and things, it's going to be the two in the digital side of things, the CIOs and things. It's going to be your HTN and your digital health. And obviously they run some of the big conferences as well. There's Hub magazine as well. I think you do need to hit them all. So that's probably where marketing can come in, because you can go to one person, they can make sure they've got the relationships and your story will go out quite widely. But there's definitely the two. Digital health has got the community, they've built community around them, which is really powerful. For like just their chat groups and things, the amount of chat that goes on in them places is brilliant. Yeah, and that spreads on to all on WhatsApp. We've got groups. Natasha's probably got a million groups, I bet, with the nurses and things. I've got my groups with the CIOs, and then there's these joint groups and things. And if something lands well in the press, and being the e-zine press rather than the BBC news, we're trying to stay away from the BBC largely, in my experience. But if something lands well, it will just create the conversation, and that spreads itself.
From my perspective, I'd say things like the Nursing Times, so specifically targeting your clinical audience, are important, but mostly people don't have time to read this stuff. So I think you have to think more broadly about how you get your messages out there and in bite-sized chunks. So obviously, LinkedIn blogs are brilliant. Do more of that. And yes, we do try and avoid the BBC, except for when it comes to virtual wards, Neil, where we've had some really positive stories out of the BBC. So actually using the wider press and thinking about how we influence the public to demand some of this stuff. The paradigm is going to shift, and people are wanting to use more technology to manage their own health. So how are we influencing? My colleague Tara Donnelly, who speaks a lot about virtual wards, often says she'd love to see on EastEnders someone being referred to the virtual ward and having care in the virtual ward, because that would have the biggest impact on people understanding this new way of working and what it can do for them.
Oh, well, there's a good idea for one of our colleagues on the line to think outside the box, right into the writers of EastEnders, try and push that
Get your tech on there.
I like that. And actually, there are some parallels with actually liaising with these e-zines, these publications, because they're pressed for time as well, those journalists. So if you can provide quality content that they can lift and utilize, that's in their interest as well. So there's a nice parallel what you're talking about in your own daily work as well. So very similar question then. In-person conferences, I think you mentioned HET and things like that, Neil, but any others that stand out that companies can attend to meet folks like yourselves?
We were talking about this. I can't remember who I was talking about with it. I think it was the Highland Marketing board, actually. I think we were talking about this. So I think the three big conferences that I would advocate are Confed for the wide audience. You've got chief execs, chief operating officers, chief nurses information officers. You get the whole board really, and below the board as well at Confed. So that's always quite a good one. But you've got to be out and about, and you've got to actually get and see people, maybe be on a stand and sort of do the talks rather than just have a stand. That's probably one of the key things, because people do tend to try and shy away from the market stalls a little bit sometimes, especially at Confed, I found. HET, always quite a good one, because you've got the north and you've got the south conferences that go on, and that tends to be a bit of a techie one, but brings the wider community out as well. And then you've got Rewired, which is probably the techies like to go there and see things. It's probably the big exhibition halls. A big focus there on HealthTech, so the software side of things. Don't see as much on the medtech side of stuff, but I think that's changing. That's definitely changing. You've got some of the big, who I'd call some of the sort of the big tech giants and things there. The medtech giants, the medical devices tech giants and things tend to be there. And you've got some opportunities to engage with marketing or sales companies that will actually be there and host a stand for you, and they get to know your technology and sell it for you as well. So it brings the cost of entry down. Necessarily, if you're sharing a stand with other people, and you've got experts that can help sell your tech for you. It's a nice way to bridge it. But I think they're the three for me. Natasha, can you think of any others?
Yeah, so I think Confed is interesting, and I noticed much more discussion around health tech in everybody's speeches. Actually, we'll probably move away from specific digital. I'd like to see us move away from digital specific into more this space where we're talking about the challenges of delivering healthcare, and therefore where this fits. And I see many more people who wouldn't class themselves as digital having those conversations in those rooms, and that's really good. I think Neil makes a good point about getting on the agenda in any way you can. People are generally quite shy. I actually was on a trade floor as future nurse at Nursing Live the other week, and it is funny how people try and scurry by or quickly put some stuff in their bag, your free merch. We didn't have any free merch. We still had a lot of nurses drop by, which was great. So there is a real thing with that trade floor. I think you need to be making more of a meaningful contribution. I think Nursing Live is a really great one for us. You get thousands of nurses there. We had Google there this time. I think they will start to do much more in the innovation space, and conferences like the one that Future Nurse partners with on Nursing Times. One of the really interesting ways that we ran that conference was a silent symposium. So there were headphones to listen to the main floor with the other activities happening at the back of the room. And our health tech sponsors there said they really liked it because they could be part of the conversation. So slightly smaller events can be really good, and using things like that. So I would say start to come to some of those nursing events, because the conversation is maturing, and we are deliberately starting to attract now that the budget holding nurses to those events, who are the people you need to speak to, because they're the people that can influence the board in terms of where they spend their money.
Yeah, thank you both. And I think that's great as well, because when you start to think about your presence at those type of events, you're trying to liaise with journalists, your social media. A lot of that you can scale according to your budget and company size as well. Appreciate not every company has the resources to put these mega stands together at some of these shows, but actually if you start to think about some of those other tools and channels you mentioned, it can be scaled quite appropriately, which I think is very welcome for our industry, which is primarily SME sized companies as well. Perhaps if I come back to you then, Natasha, there's a question here from Christopher. How do companies demonstrate credibility to clinical and clinical informatical leaders rather? How does a company demonstrate that credibility? Is it peer reviewed studies? Is it what's really resonates with you guys?
So I wouldn't be too hung up on I think it starts with listening. Okay, so you demonstrate credibility by taking the time to listen, not expecting you to be expert in everything, expert in your product, yes, but don't just go and spout your expertise. So it starts with relationship building, with listening, and what we respect is that you understand our world, or you're willing to try to understand our world. Then of course I think really any really robust evidence, case studies, peer review, depending on where you're at in your journey, but robust evidence that shows that your product has had a real impact is where you need to get to.
And then there's another question that came in, which was similar to that, around recommending or demonstrating return on investment for digital health and medtech. So I think that sort of talks to that. Is there anything else you'd add to that, Neil?
I mean, really, think of the two really. So yes, there's the evidence-based stuff. We've got this. We've done trials. We've got evidence. But some, and if we're talking SMEs, they're coming at it from a different stage. So the early adoption stage, where you might not have all that evidence. And I think part of the conversation and the listening is that if you've got an idea, it's working with the NHS to prove the idea and build the evidence. So once you've got the evidence, great, sing about it, shout about it, show it, and build more of it, because I don't think you should stop. It's no good bringing out a case study from 1980 these days, I don't think. But actually, if you haven't got it, but you're willing to do it, obviously, the price curve, the adoption curve, and all that kind of stuff, and the chasm and the gaps and things come into that. If anyone, most people on this, I'm sure, know about the gap of adoption and things. But if you're at that early stage, work with the NHS, find the right people, and build the evidence. We've done that lots of times. The NHS used to be the innovators. A lot of early tech came from the NHS itself. I just don't think we've got the capacity or budgets, or tech's moved on so much now that it's probably largely beyond. But a lot of the innovators, I bet most people on this conference have got clinicians that have come up with ideas and worked with them to build and develop those solutions as well. But it all becomes about partnering, and whether it's early stage partnering to get the evidence, or whether it's late stage adoption to prove the evidence and get mass adoption. Different tactics are needed for the different scales of companies.
Yeah, and there are some interesting programs like Tony Young's clinical entrepreneurs program that do encourage that dual wearing of hats between the clinician and that innovation space as well. I know there's been some very good success in that regard as well.
And I think thinking about things like health innovation networks as well. So the CEP is a useful program but generally it's about clinicians generating their own product. And largely that tech is 80% of the people on that are medics. So that probably needs to shift if we're going to come out with the new technologies that solve the wider problems that we face, particularly in areas like frailty and long-term condition management across the whole sector. So I think yes, the CEP is useful, but I think HINs are probably even more useful in this space. And so knowing your ecosystem, getting to know how things connect is really, really important. They run great accelerator programs for SMEs as well.
Yeah, agree with that one. We were I was in Sheffield yesterday speaking to some colleagues from the Yorkshire HIN, in fact, and we're running a webinar next Friday with the 3 London Health Innovation Networks as well. We've been running a program throughout this year with the respective 15 HINs. So very glad to hear you mention that, Natasha. Comment from Robert. Good to have you, Robert. I'm glad you're able to join us. He's very happy about your mention of Norfolk and Norwich. So how to capture this? So companies that prioritize corporate social responsibility, is there a way they can better connect with nurses through person-centered approaches that can work on valuable collaborations? Is there a role for companies that have that really at the core of their activity? How do you see that playing out? Neil, if I go with you first.
So yeah, just that bit around social responsibility and social impact as well, I guess. I think it's mandated now in tenders, 10% of the tender goes across to that. So absolutely key, and 10% you can get just by having a really good social credentials and helping with those responsibilities. Beyond that, I think it's quite hard. I think it is about the engagement and working with and being partners. I think that's what it comes down to, really being partners with either because not all tech is aimed at the NHS, the actual organisations. A lot of this tech is actually aimed at the patients. So just being part of whichever community you're selling, is it A to A or A to B, sales techniques and things like that, or know your customer, work with your customer and partner with your customer, and that I think really helps. And as credentials, sponsoring events and doing charitable events and things can help.
In terms of social value, some other thoughts from me are, really thinking, if we're thinking about person-centered care, thinking about digital inclusion, social inequalities. Have you really thought about that and how your product addresses, or how you will mitigate for where it doesn't for things? So being really clear about the social value, working with community groups and the people that your tech is designed to support. And then I think social value in terms of how are you supporting communities like the nursing community, which is 90% female. So we know we've got a challenge with women in health tech, and we want many more women involved in health tech. So why not work with a community like nursing and say, actually, we're going to help to increase the voice and support nursing. We'll do some stuff to sponsor organisations like mine who have an ambition to provide incubation support for nurse innovation. Saying that you're supporting that community to get more involved is a social value in and of itself. And actually, you might find that you come up with a great new idea for your an evolution of your product, or a great new product that solves a problem that hasn't been thought about before because we haven't been engaging with that community.
Yeah, agree with that. I mean, if you think about pretty much everything in a clinical setting, from the PPE to the cannula to everything, that'll be a nurse administering that. So it makes sense to actually engage with that community to see how your products and technologies are used in a real life setting, and how can you make their working practice easier and better. So that's a great comment. So comment here from Achara about NHS website access. So well, I mean, obviously notwithstanding the absolute necessity that is cybersecurity, is it how best to utilize that? Is there a lot of things that are just simply blocked in NHS settings, and is there a simple way around that? Any tips and tricks for our companies on the line to work around that, Neil?
Yeah, it makes me chuckle actually. So yes, there is whitelisting. It tends to be at each organisation. There's largely no central whitelisting that causes this. The NHS is a Microsoft house. We use MS Teams. That's become staple. We've had Microsoft Word, Excel, and the rest of it for the past, I can't remember when, ever since the early 2000s, I think, when the first deal was done. We moved away from Lotus Notes and things. So we're a Microsoft house. If you go and try and share stuff on Google Docs, you'll often find it's been blocked. So typically, and this isn't everywhere, but typically, because of cyber, you're going to, and other things, we tend to block social networking sites, Facebooks and things. I think people are releasing that and letting people be responsible as to what they do and things, and bring down professional conduct more than hard controls. But there are some, like social media sites and file share sites, that through firewalls and things, they get listed as a file share site, and therefore they're going to be blocked, because we don't want data being exited from the NHS uncontrolled necessarily. So good tight controls will cause some of that. Whitelisting is obviously the way around it, and I guess it's knowing your channels again for that. So if you're going to share stuff, try and use Microsoft, because that's probably not going to be blocked. Whether you like Microsoft or not, we've got it.
So all of the above, and your average staff nurse or even CNIO is so busy at work, they're not surfing on the intranet at work or trying to get onto websites. So actually, yes, it can be a constraint. There's normally a way around it in terms of some of the things that Neil's described, but actually they all have access to their own personal accounts outside of work that they will use.
Yeah. Thank you both. There's a question as well from Linda around, you mentioned people moving away from use of X or Twitter, as we are obviously known. I could probably hazard a guess as to why a lot of people are moving away from this. I know several companies, was it The Guardian the other day said they're going to come off it, which is around concerns with content moderation, hate speech, brand safety, the actions of its owner as well, perhaps, if I can hazard a guess. So I suspect that's probably where you're coming from with that comment, Natasha.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with our value set.
Yes, I think that's the most succinct way of putting it. We are actually, that's rattled by, isn't it? We're pretty much at time now, and I think I've managed to get to each of the questions that were in the chat. That was a fantastic discussion. Really enjoyed that. I think we could have gone on a bit longer, couldn't we? But I think we will start to draw that to a close. But thank you so much, Natasha and Neil, and for Matthew for putting this all together, and for colleagues on the line joining us today. Thank you. Appreciate that comment. So where are we then? So yes, well, a big thank you to everyone. I'm sure that many more of you would like to raise questions with Neil, Natasha, or other industry and NHS specialists that are involved with Highland Marketing's advisory board. So please do get in touch with the team. I think the best email address is info@highland-marketing.com. Perhaps if one of my colleagues is in the chat right now, they can pop that email address into for any follow-ups. But as I said, we have recorded this session. We will be sending that out over the next couple of days or early next week, and you'll be able to download that and get in touch with our higher marketing colleagues. I think that then just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Neil, Natasha, and Matthew, and for all of us joining us this afternoon, and to wish you all a very good weekend. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Matthew. Bye all. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.